Buonasera a tutti, buongiorno per chi ci segue da altri continenti. Oggi sono molto contenta perché nella sessione di questo seminario avremo come ospite Natalie Rothman, che per gli storici di Venezia, ma anche per gli storici dell'Impero Ottomano, in generale per gli studiosi di studi mediterranei, è una ricercatrice, una storica molto nota e che ha prodotto dei lavori molto influenti negli ultimi 10 anni. Natalie Rothman è specializzata soprattutto nella storia culturale del Mediterraneo, in particolar modo dei mediatori e dei cosiddetti brokers o trans-imperial subjects go-betweens, e è nota per aver inquadrato questo tipo di studio da un punto di vista teoretico nel quadro della genealogia storica dell'orientalismo europeo e dei suoi riflessi nel mondo levantino, e dall'altro attraverso una metodologia che privilegia lo studio delle pratiche quotidiane utilizzate da questi mediatori. In primo luogo dalle traduzioni di testi dalle lingue orientali alle lingue europee e dal loro uso, dalla loro circolazione dentro e fuori l'impero ottomano. Natalie Rothman ha maturato questa prospettiva con un percorso di ricerca molto variegato. Si è formata in antropologia storica presso l'Università di Tel Aviv e poi si è trasferita negli Stati Uniti d'America per percorrere il suo percorso di dottorato all'Università del Michigan. Nel corso degli anni ha prodotto una significativa mole di contributi sia in riviste specializzate in storiografia sia in riviste specializzate appunto nei Mediterranean Studies, e i suoi lavori più noti sono le due monografie che ha prodotto recentemente. In primis ricordiamo Brokerian Empire, Trans-Imperial Subjects Between Venice and Istanbul, pubblicato nel 2011 dalla Cornell University Press, e molto più recentemente, direi nell'anno appena passato, ha pubblicato un bellissimo libro, The Dragoman Renaissance, Diplomatic Interpreters and the Making of the Levant, che è stato pubblicato nel 2001 con il contributo della Newberry Library e che ricordo, è scaricabile gratuitamente online per scelta stessa dell'autrice dal sito della Newberry Library, se non ricordo male. La ricerca e l'esperienza generale, così come i progetti di Natalie Rothman, saranno discussi oggi da un giovane promettente studioso, nonché amico e collega di Venice in Question e di noi storici venezianisti, cioè Umberto Signori. Umberto ha conseguito il suo dottorato all'Università di Milano, specializzandosi nello studio del Levante ottomano e veneziano della fine del Seicento e dell'inizio del Settecento, e attualmente è postdoctoral scholar all'Università di Haifa, dove sta cercando appunto di ampliare questo suo progetto e questi suoi studi delle corti, focalizzati soprattutto sulle corti consolari del Mediterraneo, a partire da una prospettiva che privilegia il contesto delle isole Cicladi. Prima di lasciare la parola ai nostri due ospiti, ricordo per chi fosse nuovo di questo webinar come alcune note tecniche. Allora, ci sarà una prima parte del seminario, diciamo all'incirca un'ora, in cui Natalie Rothman e Umberto Signori discuteranno tra di loro apertamente la ricerca di Natalie. Secondariamente ci sarà una parte in cui verrà aperto un dibattito, in cui avranno spazio le domande, i commenti, le riflessioni del pubblico, di voi ascoltatori che ci seguite da casa, e potrete interagire con i nostri ospiti attraverso 3 modalità. Utilizzando la funzione commenti di YouTube, quindi scrivendo le vostre domande sui commenti, utilizzando la funzione commenti di Facebook analogamente, oppure se desiderate interagire direttamente con i discussant, potete scriverci una mail a un indirizzo che verrà posto sovraimpressione per tutto il seminario, deputazionevenezia@gmail.com. Ci scrivete e noi vi risponderemo mandandovi un link che vi darà accesso alla webcam e vi permetterà di parlare direttamente con Umberto e con Natalie. Ripeto brevemente in inglese per chi non fosse italofono. Good morning or good evening to everybody. Today we have the pleasure to host Natalie Rothman from the University of Toronto. Natalie is a prominent scholar which dedicates his research projects on the history and the culture of Mediterranean during the early modern age, in particular by studying the practices of cultural mediation and the brokers, the trans-imperial subjects who were charged with or interested by this cultural mediation. Natalie is also studies also the frame of Orientalism and the ways and of circulation of Orientalist doctrines during the early modern age, so the origins of Orientalism. And she comes from a complex trajectories of for education and research practice. She is in fact an historical anthropologist, and then she obtained a PhD at the University of Michigan with a contribution dedicated to the constructions of cultural borders between the Ottoman Empire and the Republic of Venice. Their main monographs are Bulgarian Empire, Trans-Imperial Subjects between Venice and Istanbul, that has been published in 2011, and the more recent the Dragoman Renaissance, Diplomatic Interpreters and the Making of the Levant, which is published online on free open access just last year. The research and the trajectories of Natalie Rothman will be discussed by Umberto Signori, which has obtained his PhD at the University of Milan, Italy, and which now is a postdoctoral scholar at the University of Haifa. In the Umberto's research instruments are concentrated on the Levantine area as well, and he is involved in a very ample, big research in the on the consular codes of the Eastern Mediterranean islands between 17th and 18th century. Before let the discussant speak, I just remind the organization of the seminar. There will be 1 hour of discussion led by the two hosts, and then we will have a question time of about half an hour, 3/4 of hour, 45 minutes. During the second part, this second part of the seminar, you can pose your questions or your remarks to Natalie or to Umberto via YouTube, Facebook, or ask to us to interact with our hosts via webcam. If you want to write a comment, you just use the comment function on YouTube and Facebook. Or if you want to speak directly to Natalie Rothman and Umberto Signori, you have just to write a mail to the mail address which is on screen, deputazionevenezia@gmail.com, and then we will provide you a link to connect with the webcam. So I don't want to steal any further time to Natalie Rothman and Umberto Signori. So please, let's start. And with me, see you later.
Thanks. Thanks, Cristina, for having me. And I would like to thanks also the Deputazione and Professor Rothman to be here. And I have to say that I'm quite excited because today's guest is someone whose work has been very influential from my own doctoral research and beyond. And the guest, as already Cristina said, is Natalie Rothman, Associate Professor at the University of Toronto, who is specialized in, broadly speaking, in early modern Mediterranean, the history of Venetian Ottoman cultural mediation, genealogies of Orientalism, and the relationship between translation and empire, but also the often overlooked history of archives and digital scholarship. So, Professor Rothman, welcome to Venice in Question. How are you doing today?
Very well, grazie, buonasera, grazie agli organizzatori, e specialmente a Daniele e Cristina, a Umberto. Mi scusate se parlerei primarmente in inglese stasera, ma posso intendere se vorrei chiedere qualcosa in italiano anche.
That's perfect. That's perfect. Well, actually, she's today with us to talk not only about her last book that Cristina already mentioned, but about her research, broadly speaking, because also she is still working on the collaborative project Trans-Imperial Archive, Diplomacy, Circulation, and Entanglement in the Early Modern Mediterranean, exploring the entangled history of Venetian and Ottoman chancery practices and archival formation in the early modern period. So, as is typical on this channel, I start just saying that, asking to you, Natalie, since your experiences as a graduate student at the Tel Aviv University and as a PhD candidate at the University of Michigan, Israeli and Anglophone history and anthropology have been part of your research. Can you tell us something about the inspiration you received from these academic environments? How did you get interested in the history of the Venetian-Ottoman relations?
So thank you for this question. I would say that my training at Tel Aviv University was decidedly eclectic and undisciplined in the best sense of this. I was fortunate enough to study with Gadi El-Ghazi and with members of the Cultural Research Unit. So from the very beginning, I got a very thorough introduction to social theory and to historical anthropology, as well as a history of science and social history of medieval and early modern Europe. And from the very beginning, there was a very strong emphasis in my studies on comparative and conceptual work. We read Russian semiotics, Erving Goffman, Norbert Elias, Marcel Mauss, alongside things like Foucault and the Frankfurt School. And towards the very end of my studies at Tel Aviv University, I also took a seminar with Benjamin Herbel on Venetian history. I was actually training as a German historian at that point, which really opened for me a window onto the richness of Venetian history and the very specific historiographical tradition that has shaped my outlook to this day. And I think Benny's questions about Venetian Empire in particular were formative, even at that point when I didn't know yet that I would one day become a historian of Venice to some extent. And then in Michigan, I was confronted with the various parochialisms, I would say, of European history in general and of Venetian history in particular. I was introduced to Atlantic studies early on, which allowed me to draw some, I think, critical comparisons with the conversations that Mediterraneanists were having at that point. Both the longer traditions of Brodel and Brodelian scholarship that the Atlanticists had somehow been mostly unaware of, but also critical approaches to the history of empire and race that Mediterraneanists weren't having in quite the same intensity. In my second year at Michigan, I joined the very tiny and very close-knit program in historical anthropology, as Christina mentioned, where we read Said and post-colonial theory, and where my interest in early modern Mediterranean studies suddenly required a lot more translation to speak to the interests and the historical frameworks of my peers, who were largely ethnographers working in the present in very different parts of the world. And at that point, I also had a chance to work with anthropologists like Ann Stoller and Webb Keane, who really pushed my thinking about how my interest in mediation and intermediaries could be in dialogue with other traditions of thinking about these issues. And finally, in Michigan, I had a really wonderful mentor, Diane Owen Hughes, whose work as a historical anthropologist and a historian of early modern visuality, and this very particular blend that she's been able to offer us of social and cultural history, inspired me to take materiality more seriously, to pay attention to minute details, in I think the best tradition of Carlo Ginzburg and Microstoria. So in a way, that also kind of closed a circle for me with my introduction to those very traditions of Italian history, going back to much earlier in my education. So that's kind of in a nutshell how these two traditions, I think, have shaped my own work.
Very fascinating. Thanks a lot. Well, my second question is about your first experience with Venetian history and historiography. What was your first approach to Venetian research, and which aspect attracted your attention as a scholar? Which documentary series of the Venetian archives in particular stimulated your reflections?
So as I mentioned, I owe this first and foremost to Benny Albel and to Diane Hughes. And I guess the first thing that struck me about Venetian historiography was both its kind of immense archival richness and at times unnerving insularity. And there's, as I'm sure people in this audience know, there's an immense pleasure in working the Archivio di Stato, where the collections often seem bottomless and where one always finds these really interesting nuggets that can lead to further discoveries. And when I finally got to the archives, which wasn't until 2002, I was truly taken by suppliche, these petitions and administrative responses, and the kinds of stories they tell that you often don't get in other genres. And this was not long after reading Natalie Davis's fiction in the archives, so I was kind of primed to see the immense potential of these materials for thinking about particular social groups like Sensali and Tragomani and others. And then this ability to ask very granular questions and to actually have the archival richness to dig in was very, very alluring. But I was also struck at the same time, especially after engaging for so long with the works of Said and the question of Orientalism, and becoming more and more critical of the Eurocentrism of my own educational background, I was struck by how the study of Venice as a city-state could still go on business as usual with only occasional nods to the wider geopolitics and the imperial structures that defined Venice. And to me, that seemed simply not tenable in terms of what I wanted to do with my own research. And I really wanted to understand better this relationship with the Ottoman world, which is both omnipresent in Venice and I felt had not received sufficient scholarly attention at that point, particularly from mainstream Venetian historiography. So that's kind of where I found my niche into an entry point into these conversations.
Yes, well, the suppliche are very amazing at the start. At the beginning, it can be very, very fascinating to go deeper and deeper there. Thanks. Well, How much has research into Venetian sources helped you to plan your project over the last 10 years?
So I would say this is another really great question, because one of my main regrets in life is that I wasn't forced to study Turkish and Ottoman earlier on. When I started, I was already on the tenure track. I was already expecting my first child, and my linguistic abilities at that point were simply not up to the task. And after a few years, I just came to accept that my ability to read Turkish is always going to be fairly limited, and that beyond understanding the basic syntax of the language and basic vocabulary, I will always have to collaborate with others, especially when it comes to the complexities of Ottoman. So I really had to lean into the Venetian archives as my main source, even as my research has shifted decidedly to Istanbul with the second project and now the third one. But this limitation, I think, has also forced me to practice collaborative research far more than I would have perhaps done otherwise, and also has given me some new insights into the act of translation and the inevitably very partial nature of linguistic competence and cross-linguistic interaction, and the challenges and payoffs of really reading across fields. So what does it mean to be trained as a Venetian historian and then move into Ottoman history, and kind of pick up Ottoman historiography as I went along? I think that has been challenging, but also really fruitful at times for me.
Interesting, interesting. Well, people on the move, globetrotters, go-betweens, several studies have celebrated such figures as sort of heroes who brought hybridity, multiculturalism, and blurred cultural borders between separate groups. Your first book explored in depth individuals who mediated culturally between the Venetian and Ottoman worlds. You also coined a term that has been very successful among early modern historians, transimperial subjects. Could you situate the study of this transimperial subject within the literature on the Venetian and Ottoman empires?
So, well, first of all, I think that the books does a better job than I can here to summarize the argument. But in very very briefly, I would say that transimperial subjects is precisely my attempt to move away from this facile celebration of hybridity, multiculturalism, and fluid cultural borders. And I say facile not just because I think that analytically it's a shorthand, but also historically, empirically, I think it really misrepresents what the early modern Mediterranean was about. And instead, to critically examine the labor of mediation and the ideological assumptions that underwrite ideas of these entirely distinct cultures that are somehow being bridged. I emphatically don't think that transimperial subjects were hybrid in any meaningful way. And I don't actually know who or what is hybrid when we talk about human beings. It was also my reaction, I think, as a Mediterraneanist to one of the real limitations of early post-colonial work in the Atlantic that objectified alterity and took it as a given, kind of taking for granted that we're talking about first encounter, first contact between radically different societies and cultures. And when you look at Venetian Ottoman interactions as your paradigm, rather than say Cortes in Mexico, it is very clear that mediation was inherently multifaceted and kind of longue durée, and that it rarely involved parties who had nothing in common or who were kind of meeting each other for the first time. And that the power dynamic at play is also very different. We're not talking here about the kind of predetermination of colonialism in the wake of conquest and ecological devastation, but rather different imperial formations that are interacting over many centuries that have a very deep knowledge of one another. And so the question of mediation becomes a lot more complex and interesting in terms of what exactly is being mediated. What is the difference that is being insisted on that facilitates or that creates the conditions of possibility for certain people to claim particular kinds of mediation? And so by coining this new term, transimperial subjects, I really wanted to call attention both to the imperial spaces that these subjects inhabit, and that shape, I think, their outlook in really profound ways, and to the fact that it is they who make it their business to cross, and in the process of crossing, to establish where the boundaries lie between units. And I should say that this is, of course, not my own. I wish I were that smart to come up with this insight. Anthropologists have pointed out how ethnicity is first and foremost an act of boundary drawing, boundary marking some 50 years ago. But I think there is a certain urgency in bringing these insights to a part of the world where cultural boundaries have been subsequently reified, and where the political stakes of this reification and the erasure of deeper historical connections and memories of those connections have had such profound political stakes. And finally, on a more personal note, if I may, I should say that when I became a professional historian, I was quite determined never to study Israel. But I thought I would make a terrible historian of Israel, given my own kind of strong political convictions. But I think that it is precisely the experience of growing up in a society where the crudest kinds of Orientalism and Islamophobia and claims to radical difference have gone hand in hand with settler colonialism for over a century, and that these kinds of Orientalism continue to shape political imaginaries in the most visceral and in most tragic way. I think it really made it impossible for me not to center these themes in my research. And so in that sense, my take on trans-imperial subjects is in some way, I think, decidedly unromantic. I grew up in a society where these claims to know the enemy have really authorized the worst kinds of war crimes. But it also made it possible for me to understand the epistemological potential of looking at these processes from the vantage point of those doing the mediation, and not romanticizing the role, but rather taking seriously the kind of epistemological work that these intermediaries perform and its consequences.
Wow, you gave us a lot to think about, really. It was really, really strong what you said. Really interesting. Well, and just switch with your second book, that you worked on diplomatic knowledge production and on the genealogies of Orientalism, as you already said. And this research mainly focuses on the protagonist who produced a specific knowledge of the Ottomans among European observers, the dragomans. What implication does this research provide on the Venetian representation of the Ottoman Empire? And how does dragomans' cultural mediation history allow us to rethink Venetian diplomacy in Constantinople?
So again, I would really encourage people to read the Dragoman Renaissance. And the short answer is first that I think by focusing on dragomans, like other invisible technicians, to use I think what is a very useful concept from Stephen Shapin and the History of Science, we decenter the patricians first and foremost, and their perspectives on the world, which I think has largely dominated the literature on Venetian Ottoman diplomacy. And we begin to see the role that other diplomatic personnel play, not just socially, not just in kind of the practical aspects of mediation, of who's doing the writing, who's doing the moving of the textual artifacts from one chancery to another, etc., but also epistemologically. So it's not just the patricians' perspectives that matter to the story. And second, and very much related to the first, what I emphasize in the book is that dragomans didn't simply invent or skew representations of the Ottomans for their interlocutors in the Venetian patriciate. They rather refracted very specific understandings of Ottoman history, social relations, material culture, and especially language that were already in vogue among contemporaneous Ottoman courtly elites. They engaged in the project of Translatio Imperii Studi, to put it in simple terms. And this really turns on its head, I think, a lot of our ideas about Orientalism and where it's coming from, who produced this body of knowledge, where and when we start thinking about this knowledge as something that is happening through the circulation of Ottoman ideas, Ottoman ideologies, of language and history. And that's kind of what the book also tries to emphasize. So to return to your question of how Dragoman's cultural mediation history allows us to rethink Venetian diplomacy in Istanbul, I think it really reinforces the urgency of studying Venetian and Ottoman history as entangled history, not as two entirely separate worlds that encounter one another, but as deeply relational historical processes that need to be studied as interdependent histories, of course, with a host of other processes and other spaces, other political formations that extend both to Europe and into Asia, but that we can't continue to think of these as simply separate entities encountering one another.
Okay. Wow. You're very fast in answering. We have a lot of time, so we can slow down if you want. But also, well, let's go further. You also followed the documentary trail of the Venetian dragons through non-Venetian archives and libraries, collecting very heterogeneous sources like relazioni, grammar books, translation of Ottoman charters, and even picture representation, and often sources produced by the interpreters themselves. Could you tell us how the comparative study of these sources can change the narratives on Venetian-Ottoman relations?
Certainly. So for one, I would say that following the paper trail of these dragomans to places like Vienna and Capodistria, Koper, and London really gave me a better appreciation both of what was specifically and powerfully Venetian about the dragomanate, about this collective of dragomans, and how dragomans themselves spawned these dynasties and inspired institutions and practices and discourses that go far beyond Venice. It allowed me to think with dragoman's portraits, for example, about what it means to claim home and cultural belonging in a place like Istria for a group of dragomans who were very much grounded in the Istanbulite elite milieu of the late 17th century. What does it mean for them to have this dual relationship with a faraway place, and how they understood the relationship both to these kin that were far away and at the same time in the local Orthodox community. The dragomans were Catholic, but a lot of their immediate relatives were Orthodox in a world where these religious differences were quite significant. And how, for example, they consumed and refined their tastes and engaged in various forms of sociability with other members of courtly society, both in Istanbul and in places like Venice and Vienna. So in a way, it made the Ottoman-Venetian connection both more unique and also at the same time grounded in these broader networks of patronage and kinship.
Wow. Well, and this brings us directly to the last question. How do you put together all these diverse sources into coherent text and research?
So there are three things that I can say to this, or three adverbs, I guess, to respond to the how. Slowly, collaboratively, and digitally. So let me explain what I mean by this. Slowly has to do with the fact that I had this incredible luxury of a year-long doctoral fellowship to spend in the archives in Venice. And this was truly invaluable and something that I think current pressures on doctoral funding make very, very hard to imagine, let alone pursue 20 years later. I really can't emphasize enough how critical this immersion in the archives is. We were talking earlier about the fact that now you can digitize images from archival materials in your post in the reading room in the Archivio. When I was there, you couldn't take photos, period. You had to pay for the photographic services to do it. It was prohibitively expensive for a graduate student. And this slow research, quote unquote, I think is the way research really happens, where you immerse yourself in the sources, where you spend time. You know, I transcribed entire processi in the Sant'Uffizio records, suppliche, that led nowhere in the end. but they didn't actually lead nowhere, in the sense that even if they didn't make it as empirical cases that I analyzed specifically in any of my publications, I think they gave me a certain kind of understanding of the archives, of the genre, of kind of conventions, and what's all the unsaid and unseen aspects of the production of these materials that you don't get when you just frantically digitize insane amounts of material and expect to go through them later. So there is a certain rhythm to working in the archives that is a true luxury that I think a lot of students don't get nowadays, that I think really, really shaped my outlook. And with that comes certain kinds of sociability with other students in the archives. You know, when you're there for a whole year, you make friends, you go out for splits, and you get to know people who work in very different traditions. You learn to listen in a different kind of way. So that was one aspect of this, the slowness of the research. The second aspect is the collaborative aspect, and thinking broadly about who my interlocutors are, what conversations I'm interested in having, and with whom. I mentioned earlier that I had a very unorthodox education, spending a lot of time talking to anthropologists, to people working in very different historiographical traditions in entirely different parts of the globe, on different periods. A lot of people who work on 19th and 20th century stuff, but also antiquity folks. Really opens up different kinds of conversation, different kinds of vocabularies, different kinds of conceptual frameworks for situating my research. And alongside that, also recognizing the limitations of my linguistic and methodological skill set. So this kind of working with others, whether it's Ottomanists or archivists, or in recent years, data scientists and digital scholars, has I think helped shape my research in really meaningful ways, which kind of leads me to the third and final point on working digitally. I think that linked data methods and ontology building specifically, this effort to think about our terminologies and to think about how different terms are relationally structured, both in our own kind of conceptual vocabularies, but also in the archival materials that we engage with, and the kind of unspoken connections and distinctions that the producers of these documents were making in their own heads and in their own textual practices, has really helped push my current project on the archives of the Bailo, and also to delve into Dragoman's translation practices more deeply. And it's where I want to take this is to also say that this is not just about my own individual background and educational trajectories, but also about kind of the political economy of the academy at this juncture. Because I think that the kind of work that I do, to do it well, and I hope I'm doing it well, but to have a chance at doing it well, relies on the kinds of institutional infrastructures and academic labor practices and funding models that are becoming increasingly rare at the moment. I really don't think I could have done this kind of work pre-tenure or in a less wealthy institution, or without the kinds of resources that are available to me at the University of Toronto, but that unfortunately are being clawed back and are not available to a lot of more junior scholars. The kinds of collaborations that I have with our digital scholarship unit at the library and with digital librarians, the kinds of long-term collaborations with Ottomanists and others in other institutions where we can meet each other pre-COVID especially, but now also digitally, and to work our way through materials together and bring our different perspectives. Those are luxuries that are not available to a lot of people who are in more precarious situations of employment and who don't have the backing of institutions with deep pockets and ability to invest in these kinds of infrastructures. And so I think as we think about where these kinds of historiographical processes are taking us, I think we also need to push for these resources and to make sure that we don't necessarily embrace too happily the kind of funding models that work on very short-term projects and that pour a lot of resources into very short-term collaborations and don't allow for longer-term kind of slow scholarship. That's kind of where I would like to end this with.
Well, thanks. I think that I can totally share your point of view and your call. So, and we're finished now. Thank you again. Christina should appear again.
Okay.
Oh, here we are.
You have been very fast, and but there is no problem. We can deep the some topics of the discussion, even with people who are following us. I hope there will be more questions, but me too. I have many questions, of course, about your research, in particular about your last work on the dragomans. I I came across the introduction and I have seen you mention Talal Assad, that is an anthropologist who has talked about the westernization of the Eastern Mediterranean and its relationship with the modernization. So I was wondering what is your relationship from the theoretical point of view, of course, with the question of the modernization of the Ottoman Empire in the early modern period before the Tanzimat? Do you think is appropriate to talk about some autochthone, not Western governed modernization, looking at special people, culture, and urbanized people as were the Dragomans, for example. Do you think the Dragomans conveyed some kind of modernization, and how could you how would you problematize? I'm sorry, the problem, the question of the supposed modernization of European countries phase two, the auto backwardness of Levantine areas, and so on. Thank you.
So I should preface my comments by saying that this is not at all my area of specialty, but I think Ottomanists for a long time have rejected the very framework of modernization as a useful paradigm for thinking about the 18th century in the Ottoman Empire. And to the extent that it was a very neglected period for a very long time, it has now been studied much more closely by scholars, by historians of many different stripes. And I think the overwhelming perspective is not just that modernization is a tautological and teleological concept that doesn't allow us to understand how Ottomans understood transformations in the political culture of the empire, in its material culture, in its political economy. But that it in some ways presupposes modernization in Europe in ways that Europeanists would say is far more complex and nuanced and non-unidirectional. I mean, I'm thinking here specifically about Italy and the scholarship on Italy in the 18th century and the critiques of this one-size-fits-all, as if we know what modernization is, and that's because Italy or Italian polities some supposedly failed to modernize their economies along the patterns that we see in England or in certain parts of Germany and France, that somehow modernization didn't arrive in Italy until the Risorgimento. I think there are other ways of thinking about a period that was certainly a period of radical transformation, both for the Ottomans and for others. And certainly the very shifting economic fortunes of the Mediterranean had something to do with it, without necessarily trying to fit it into the mold of modernization, and without assuming that Ottoman elite interactions with the world around them were a priori framed by a sense of inferiority or a sense of dependency. And in that sense, I think it also opens up the field for what we're seeing now, which is a flourishing in the history of Ottoman science, history of Ottoman technology, that looks at the 18th century and thinks about the ways in which Ottoman intellectuals engaged very deeply with, Copernican science, with mapping technologies, with a whole range of understandings of an expanding kind of global consciousness that typifies the scientific revolution, without assuming that they were somehow lacking or lagging or coming late to the party, but rather that that there was a very much fermentation and intellectual curiosity and originality to the ways in which 18th century Ottoman elites, whether in the circles around Muteferica or in places like later on Alexandria, produce very, very interesting writings and very interesting perspectives on this kind of cultural upheaval that is not necessarily bound to ideas of modernization the way 19th and 20th century social science would frame the question. Sorry, this was a very long answer.
No, but it's good. It's good for us. I even also because the Dragomans, it was to the European ambassadors and visitors of travelers in the Ottoman Empire to depend on the Dragomans. That's interesting point, that the Dragomans were an active subject, whereas it's in some way it's a defiance of a too much static view of the Western, the Eastern world, Eastern Mediterranean, and I would say also the Eastern Europe, because similar problems are we can find similar problems in the Balkans and so on. So it's very interesting, this subjectivities and this protagonism of the Dragons as the playmaker of the narrations and information about the Ottoman Empire. And donc, and I'm sorry, sometimes I mix English with French. And the way the information which was produced by the Drogmans affected the European view of the Eastern world, of the Levantine world, and I would on this subject, on this matter, I would like to ask you to remind us your definition of Levantine. It is a productive definition from the scientific point of view, from the theoretical point of view. It is too much dualist. How about the epistemological heuristical value of this notion of Levantine?
I'm happy to talk about that. I just want to add one more thing to the previous discussion, and thank you for centering the question again on the question of dragomans, because I think that alongside all the radical erasures of the post-Tanzimat era, we also have, and of course the dissolution of the Ottoman Empire and the various kinds of nationalisms to emerge from these ashes. I think there is a certain ways in which the historical memory of the Ottoman Empire, particularly among non-specialists, and in popular imaginaries, but not only, kind of collapses the Ottoman Empire into a certain kind of Turkish nationalism and forgets that these dragomans and other Christian elites in places like Istanbul and Izmir and Alexandria and elsewhere were very much Ottoman. They were not minorities the way they're framed in 19th and early 20th century discourses. They were, sure, this is not to celebrate some kind of romantic multiculturalism, which is completely inappropriate for earlier centuries of the Ottoman experience, but they were very much part of the Ottoman elite. Dragomans worked not only for foreign consulates, the chief dragoman of the imperial divan was, for all intents and purposes, acting like the foreign minister of the Ottoman Empire in many contexts, and acted as ambassador when traveling. And these were, from the 1670s on, and in some cases earlier, Greek Orthodox Phanariots from Fener, from a neighborhood in Istanbul. These were not somehow outside the Ottoman elite. They were the Ottoman elite. And the Ottoman elite itself is comprised, to a certain extent, sometimes much greater extent than others, from converts that come from what today we would call the Balkans. So to think of the Ottoman Empire as entirely outside Europe and to think of dragomans as not Ottoman is, again, a certain kind of historical erasure and misrepresentation that is very violent to the historical record. To go back to your question about Levantines, yes, I mean, I think, again, there is a certain kind of reification of the category that in some sense is kind of autochthonous to certain kinds of populations in the Eastern Mediterranean, particularly in the 20th century. But when one looks at kind of the genealogy of this term in the 16th and 17th centuries, it is very much connected to Venetian policies and other Italian polities that are doing business in the Eastern Mediterranean and are actively courting merchants from that part of the world to come and settle, and certain kinds of semantic distinctions that emerge between, for example, Eastern Levantine Jews and other kinds of Jews who had lived on the Italian peninsula and in the Greek islands for many centuries. And these distinctions are mobilized to serve particular political projects, whether by the individuals and communities that stand to benefit, certain kinds of Armenian groups, certain kinds of Jewish mercantile groups, certain kinds of Greek and other Christian Ottoman populations, or by these governments that often, frankly, are not very well informed about the ethnic politics of the Ottoman Empire, or about the internal fissures within different kinds of collectivities that are framed by religion, but that have their own internal divisions. And so it's not that Levantine is not a useful category, but that it, like everything else, needs to be historicized, and that what counts as Levantine in 1620 in Venice is very, very different than what is Levantine in kind of for the Ottoman intelligentsia in 1905, if that makes sense.
Of course. Thank you very much for this answer. Umberto, do you have any suggestions?
Yes, if there are no questions yet, yes, I could take advantage of my position to just ask a question about my curiosity by reading your last book. It is, again, I would like to go back to these people, to the dragomans. I was really intriguing by the fact that you talked also about a nexus between dragomans' knowledge production practices and, let's say, the making the Venetian dragomanate de facto hereditary position. Could you tell us something more about that I really found interesting and fascinating, that point?
Certainly. So that's where the social history and family history methodologies that I learned early on, I think, have been really fruitful in demonstrating in a very, very powerful way how, even though the dragomans that Venice recruits come from very different sources of recruitment, some of them come from Venice, some of them come from these colonial elites in places like Capodistria. Many of them come from the Catholic community of Istanbul. By the mid 17th century, they're all very much intermarried, and like other professional groups and skilled workers in the early modern world, come to expect their positions to be not quite a sinecure, although later on we have some of that as well, but hereditary and passed on from father to son, from uncle to nephew, etc. And part of that process also involves very, very deep and multiple intermarriage, both within the Venetian dragomanate. So any dragoman apprentices recruited from Venice, if they stand to stay in Istanbul long term, would need to marry, or at least try to marry, the daughter of a more senior Istanbul-born dragoman. And across, kind of laterally across embassies. So the Venetian dragomans marry into the Habsburg dragomans, and the Habsburg dragomans marry into the French dragomans, and the French marry into the Dutch. And by the 18th century, you look at the kinship maps, and I really urge people who are interested in this to check it out on the platform for the project. And you can see how everyone at some point is connected to everyone else by marriage, which of course we know from the anthropology of kinship has certain entailments in terms of what one can and cannot do, what kinds of social disciplining is possible, what kinds of circulation of knowledge and rumor is afforded by these very established dynasties of dragomans. Now, some of this is still speculative in the sense that we still, there is a whole lot we don't know about dragomans. In my new project on the archives, one of the things that really intrigued me and that I wasn't really able to answer is the extent to which dragomans are operating not just as a community of practice, not just as kind of apprenticeship-based community where a senior member of the group is followed and shadowed by junior members who learn by doing, by observing what the senior person is doing, but also more formalized, particularly when it comes to writerly habitus. Did dragoman families keep their own archives as sources of information on how to write certain kinds of genres, how to translate certain kinds of terms? Did they have word lists? Did they have dictionaries? Intuitively, I want to say, of course they did. It's inconceivable that they didn't, both from everything we know from Filippo de Vivo and his students about, archival workers and chancery workers not necessarily having the same kinds of distinctions that modern professionals have about the distinction between workplace and home, and often keeping official state records at home. And just logically, if you're a dragoman and you have access to all these materials that are very valuable, and you have the technological know-how to reproduce them because your scriptural ability is superb, why wouldn't you make a copy, either to inform you or to sell to someone else? These dragomans were, very crafty and very kind of market-oriented in their approach to their labor. They withheld labor when they needed to. They had all kinds of business dealings on the side, despite everything that the Venetian government told them they couldn't do. They often had siblings in commerce, long-distance commerce. So it seems almost inconceivable that they wouldn't make copies of records and keep them at home, either for their own use or to trade. But I haven't found any of that, partly because these households haven't survived the 19th century for the most part, and we don't have these family records kept, with the exception of those materials that were transferred back to Istria, but that's a very small portion, and one branch that moved to Vienna, where I'm in the process of studying these materials and trying to understand what we can glean from them. But for the kind of core of this dragoman milieu that stayed in Istanbul. We really don't have these family archives to work with. Most of the church archives no longer survive either. So there are real limitations to go back to how rich the Venetian archives are. We don't have that same kind of richness, even in the Başbakanlık. And so there are still very open questions, but I think it stands to reason that there is this kind of tight connection between the knowledge that these dragons produced and this deeply, deeply endogamous kind of almost caste-like nature of the dragomanate in this period.
Very very interesting points. Which make me, of course, you point out that the dragons.
Christina, may I just add something about? I think that our audience is a bit shy because of the English language. Potete scrivere anche domande in italiano se volete. Professoressa,
allora, lo specifico in italiano, noi stiamo parlando in inglese, ma la professoressa Rothman è perfettamente capace di capire l'italiano, lo legge, lo parla correntemente, quindi non esitate a porre questioni, commenti o domande in italiano, possiamo farlo in ogni momento, non c'è nessun problema.
Certo.
Scusa se ti ho interrotta.
No, ma figurati. No, avrei dovuto dirlo da principio, me ne sono un attimo dimenticata perché poi la conversazione ha preso naturalmente una piega anglofona, ma è giusto ricordarlo. È un seminario internazionale, ma di origine veneziana.
Certo.
Allora, io ho una domanda in italiano sperando perché è una domanda lunga, quindi allora tu giustamente hai sottolineato come è difficile capire esattamente le pratiche, i modi di educazione, di acculturazione dei dragomanni, il modo in cui gli strumenti che usavano per tradurre, per produrre i loro testi. E ho letto nel tuo libro che effettivamente loro però avevano accesso a delle biblioteche, a dei testi, anche a dei siti archeologici che nel 600-700 iniziano ad essere un oggetto di interesse per la ricerca degli eruditi europei. E questa è una cosa che mi ha interessato molto, perché effettivamente nello stesso periodo questi viaggiatori europei si recano anche nelle isole veneziane, nelle isole greche sotto dominio veneziano come Corfù, proprio per cercare di reperire oggetti d'arte, libri, oggetti, siti archeologici, testimonianze del passato antico.
Manoscritti, certo.
Con gusto un po' neoclassico, ecco, se vogliamo. E la differenza, secondo me, è che mentre a Corfù questi viaggiatori prendevano come intermediari delle persone che non avevano una carica istituzionale, cioè degli anziani del villaggio, the elders of the village, oppure delle persone locali che vivevano nell'isola senza, e che magari avevano molti contatti sociali, però senza ricoprire necessariamente dei ruoli istituzionali e delle posizioni sociali preminenti, come invece avveniva nel caso dei dragomanni. E quello che mi ha colpito è che i dragomanni avevano un patrimonio relazionale che dipendeva molto dalla loro posizione all'interno del sistema politico dell'impero ottomano. E quindi mi ha colpito quello che tu hai detto sulla difficoltà di reperire le loro biblioteche, però loro di fatto erano degli agenti che conoscevano le persone e le risorse sia umane che istituzionali per cercare la cultura oltre che per produrla. In questo senso vedo una sorta di dipendenza degli europei anche da queste figure di dragomanni. E come pensi che il ruolo così fondamentale dei dragomanni nel reperire le fonti archeologiche, le fonti d'arte, le fonti di cultura abbia influito nella maniera per esempio nella nascita delle prime storiografie europee, insomma, della cultura europea di fatto? Cioè, mi rendo conto che è una domanda un po' larga, però se hai qualche spunto di riflessione da darci, naturally in English.
Yeah, no, thank you for this. I think this is a really important question, and I'm always mindful of the danger, when you study dragomans, you start thinking that dragomans really have their hand in everything. And I wouldn't go as far as to say that, they kind of single-handedly create this field of course, they don't create anything, because we have humanists, as you pointed out, going to the Aegean and centuries earlier, and so this is not something that starts in the 17th century. But certainly, we know, for example, in the French case, that dragomans are absolutely critical for the establishment of Oriental libraries, like Derbelot's Bibliothèque Orientale and the collections of Louis XIV, and there the connection is very, very evident, because we know that the individuals who end up as royal librarians and royal secretaries in Paris in charge of cataloging these manuscripts brought from Istanbul are themselves dragomans or had been trained as dragomans, but also that when Colbert sends them on missions to acquire manuscripts in Istanbul, he's specifically thinking of Jean de Lange, these dragomans in training, as a cadre that can produce this kind of knowledge and facilitate this kind of commerce. So dragomans absolutely are pivotal. We know, and I think I talk about it in the book, that yes, they serve as kind of local fixers for archaeological digs, for the acquisition of antiquities, for the acquisition of manuscripts. But it's not just kind of local arrangements type of work. It's deep epistemological work. They're the ones who can read the Ottoman text, and so when they go with various European scholars who are sojourning in Istanbul, and when they go to booksellers to purchase manuscripts, it's the dragomans who know what to ask for. It's the dragomans who know to evaluate whether these manuscripts are worth the money, how to read them, how to interpret them. We have the correspondence of the Tarsia brothers with the British ambassador later on, precisely around these matters, where they advise. The Tarsias were dragomans for Venice, and the descendants of dragomans and related to other dragoman families. They're really at the heart of this group. But they worked for the British ambassador for a while to translate manuscripts. We have a similar example for Luigi Marsili, whose library is in Bologna now, and whose long sojourn in Istanbul is entirely in the house of the Bailo, and he goes with, again, the same Tarsia to look at manuscripts, to look at antiquities, to buy a horse, to talk to the horse breeder about the genealogy of the horse, to translate the genealogy of the horse. So there's real connections there that, again, we're only beginning to study because the documentary evidence for it is so dispersed across European libraries and archives. But now with increased digitization, we're also finding these connections in sometimes very unexpected places. So I think this is certainly where the research can go further.
Mm.
Yes. That's true. I can add that also my Venetian consuls were doing the same thing. They were mediating and providing medals especially, but also other anticaglie, antiquaries, to the Bailo especially. And as you said before, it's the same. Actually, the Venetian consuls especially usually were Ottoman subject originally. So as you start to think and study the consuls, it's like you said about dragomans, you think that they have their hands everywhere. So it's really
and the
interesting.
consuls and the dragomans are also connected in really interesting ways, and I would love to talk to you more about it, because several consuls actually sent their sons to be apprenticed as dragomans in Istanbul, and it always seemed to me that these sons made terrible dragomans. They never continued, they never made a career as dragomans. But politically, I think this was a way of fostering the connection with Venice and also gaining a foothold in diplomatic circles and diplomatic patronage that must have been very valuable for these consuls in fairly remote islands. And so it would be good to think through what these connections are and what the benefits were for both sides as well.
Yes, absolutely. Especially with the case, I think you are thinking about the Balsarini case.
Balsarini, yes, absolutely.
But also, Cristina made really a good point in just asking. It's a good point asking what can create this their mediation about our thinking, the Orientalism, and also our way of thinking about antiquitaries.
Yeah.
It's really a good question.
And I think to go back to Christina's point, it's also that there is a different kind of, as you say, different kind of political infrastructure, because the reason why the Venetian patricians can travel to the Aegean Islands and just find the village elder and do a dig without getting anyone's permission is precisely because this is all happening within the frame of Venetian Empire. Whereas when they go to Istanbul, they're under a very different sovereign. And if anything, the Venetians in Istanbul, much to their dismay, are operating as a client state to a very large degree that we're only now beginning to understand the extent to which the ceremonial at court for the Venetians was very much that same ceremonial that they applied to Ragusa and to other client states, and the kinds of taxation they were subject to, the kinds of rituals. I don't want to push the point too much, but in a way, the Venetians are keenly aware of their subservient status in Istanbul, and as much as they like to tout their prominence vis-a-vis other European foreign legations, they are not interacting with the Ottomans as equals, and they can't afford to enrage Ottoman officials by going and just digging into the ground and lifting antiquities, even in a context where antiquities are not understood in the same way that they are today as cultural patrimony. There are real limitations to their operations, and they have to go through more official channels. They have to go through these structures of authority where the dragomans are understood as an official intermediary in ways that they don't have to do when they go to Candia, for example.
But I specify that when I was talking about the travelers in the Venetian islands, I was not meaning only the Venetian patricians, but also European travelers who used to take informal contacts beyond the permission of the authorities. So there is an institutional frame, but this constitutional frame is also sometimes circumvented because it's not. It depends from the balance of power in every island. So, but you have taken the point in underlining the difference between with the Ottoman empires that induces us to enlarge the questions, to do further research, because there are many points that are not yet clear, because it's a very complex reality, not just for the cultural, evident cultural complexity, but also for the complexity of the frameworks within the Ottoman institutions. institutional structure. There is a contrast, for example, a tension, unresolved tension between the center and the periphery. You point out in your book that this is not to consider a dualism, a static dualism. We need to rethink of the concept of center and peripheries. There is no rigid hierarchy. Sometimes the marginal urban centers can which can provide us a different point of view on the ways the political activity of the drug months took place. Can you talk? Can you tell us some suggestions about this discursive and dynamic reality, urban reality within which hosted the activity of the drug months? Istanbul was the center, was of course, but what kind of center was Istanbul?
Wow, that's another big question where I think there's a lot more research coming to the fore now with a younger generation of Ottomanists really digging into the Başbakanlık archives in general, but also into Sharia court records, where we get a lot of the granularity of kind of the urban dynamic kind of explored in fascinating detail. So here I'm very much relying on the work of other scholars who've looked at this, but I'm fascinated by this tension between the Venetian consulate, the Beylit, and other diplomatic embassies that are established in what today's Beyoğlu and at the time was called Galata, Pera, right above it, very leafy kind of suburb or district. The center of gravity of diplomatic and commercial activity is in the 16th and 17th centuries. So the tension between these diplomatic households and the households that dragomans themselves established, and the clearly much more complex urban dynamics that they are often part of, that exceed the power of these embassies and that sometimes really threaten the authority of ambassadors over their dragomans. Again, for those who read the book, they will know that part of the power of dragomans was precisely that ambassadors rarely spoke Ottoman, and were very much dependent on dragomans to mediate most of their interactions with the outside world. And dragomans, on the other hand, were very well established locally, had family in high places, including in the Ottoman court in some cases. Were very comfortable in multiple languages of Istanbul, including Ottoman and Greek. And they had all kinds of resources. They kept enslaved people in their household. Only in recent years, we're starting to understand the extent to which dragomans were both involved in the ransoming of slaves, Ottoman slaves in Europe, and in the keeping of enslaved persons in their own households. Many of the protagonists of my book had many enslaved people living in their houses, but they also had other kinds of patronage and kinship ties that gave them access to resources far beyond the Beylit. So I think this, again, raises important questions about the urban dynamics, about the kinds of conversations they could have, the kinds of socializing that they had with members of the Ottoman political elite, but also with other foreigners, with other kinds of elites, what kinds of scholars they were in communication with. And again, there's a whole lot we still don't know about this, but that I think we can really shape this research going forward as more and more of the archives become available to us to ask these kinds of questions.
Okay. Umberto, do you have any further suggestions or remarks or questions?
Well, I can continue forever, I guess, but there are no questions from the
Yeah,
audience.
yeah, of course, me too. I was checking, but unfortunately, for the moment, we have no question of intervention from the public. Um, I have just a little curiosity because Dragomans had a proximity with juridical language, with juridical sources, because they did a political activity, diplomatic activity. Uh, it was a question of Ottoman juridical sources, Ottoman secular juridical sources, that is the former Byzantine tradition, or the Canon, or so on, was rather the religion, the religious tradition of the tribunals of Cadi, or what kind of juridical sources dogmas depended on, and were there interactions with other juridical traditions, for example, foreign law, foreign international jus gentium, for international diplomatic law, which in the European context was a reference point?
So the short answer is all of the above, in the sense that even though technically dragomans were governed by the Ahname, by the capitulations, and as such were understood to be under the jurisdiction of their respective employer, whether it's the bailo or the French ambassador or the English ambassador, etc. We see, again, this is mostly anecdotally at this point, but I suspect it will get more attention in coming years and studied more systematically. We do see dragomans taking advantage of the jurisdictional pluralism of Istanbul and the Ottoman Empire more broadly, and taking their cases to all kinds of courts to achieve all kinds of goals. So, on occasion, we find in the chancery records of the bailo hujjats, which are these legal writs produced by a qadi that a dragoman's wife is able to secure for her inheritance, or all kinds of mostly real estate records that are procured from Ottoman officials because they serve the interests, especially of daughters and wives and sisters of dragomans, because of different inheritance laws that are more beneficial for women in some contexts in under Qadi law. So we do see a great ingenuity and awareness by dragomans to the opportunities that are opened up by their ability to take recourse to different kinds of juridical traditions and different kinds of juridical institutions, and taking full advantage of it. And on the other hand, we sometimes see relatives of dragomans who are all Ottoman subjects trying to bring their commercial disputes to the bailo and trying to be judged under Venetian law. And the bailo confronted with the challenge of telling them, but you're Ottoman subjects, I can't serve as a tribunal for your litigation. You have to take it to another court. So I think there's something very interesting going on there in terms of kind of the very specialized legal know-how that these dragoman families possessed, and their ability to leverage that knowledge to their advantage in all kinds of situations.
Okay, thank you very much. I don't see any further question. I would continue forever and ever because your itinerary or your scientific itinerary is very rich. Um, is very is interdisciplinary in the right sense of term. So the suggestion and the reflection and are infinite, potentially infinite. Um,
I just have a
okay,
curiosity to ask about
okay, Umberto.
how can I call them, pictorial visual representation that you
Uh-huh.
find in this very curious codex in Cicogna, I think it was
Mhm.
in Correr,
In
and
the
the
Correre.
other one in St. Petersburg. Uh,
Mhm.
how did you find them?
So the one in the Correre has been known to scholars for many years. There's a published facsimile edition that came out from a shared exhibition in Istanbul and Venice several decades ago, I think already. So I was able to study that one when I was in Venice at the Correre. And then I published an article about that manuscript and got an email literally out of the blue from the director of the Oriental section of the Hermitage Museum Library, telling me about this other part of the manuscript, which scholars hypothesized about because there was a black and white facsimile edition that was published by a German Orientalist in the 1920s and was on loan to one of the museums in Berlin when World War II broke out. And scholars always assumed that in the bombardments of World War II, that manuscript was destroyed. But it turns out that it wasn't destroyed. It was taken by the Red Army soldiers back to the Soviet Union and was simply not cataloged for many years, but has emerged
Oh,
in recent years as part of incredible cataloging efforts at the Hermitage and is now situated there. And she basically invited me to come and study it and was very, very kind and gracious in facilitating my visit and accompanied me to show me some of their other collections. Um, and being able to see this manuscript, the actual manuscript, really, of course, there is nothing comparable to interacting with the actual manuscript. You can't understand the manuscript in the same way by looking at a facsimile, let alone a black and white facsimile from a century ago. So it was really my good luck that she contacted me. I can't take credit for discovering it. She was the one who said, "We have it here, and we're pretty sure that this is the one that you talk about in your article. Would you like to come and see it?"
wow.
Yeah.
And how was this discovery? How did it help you
It
in your
really changed my
research?
my understanding of, I mean, again, there are so many unanswered questions about when this manuscript was divided into and why and how, and so there is a whole lot we still don't know, and I hope that someone with better codicological training than myself can study this in greater depth, because I'm sure that there is codicological evidence in these manuscripts to answer more questions. But from my perspective, it was really telling to consider what parts of this codex were kept in the Correr, or obviously they weren't in the Correr at the time it was divided, but were kept in some kind of Venetian collection, and what parts were hived off into a separate codex, because there are real differences in the kinds of miniatures, the kind of images in the two codices, and the kinds of story they tell about the Ottomans and about Ottoman-Venetian relations. There is a lot more of the kind of the diplomatic and military confrontational aspect in the Correr manuscript than there is in the St. Petersburg one, et cetera, et cetera. So there is, it certainly allowed me to look at the division of this manuscript in a slightly different way.
Very fascinating, really. I hope that someone once will email me telling me that there is a private archive of my consul, so
there you are.
it will be
Nice.
really fantastic.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. But I guess there will be no more intervention, I think, because we can. Umberto, if you have a further question, just tell me. But I think we have me and you. We have. Taken the scene for a long time.
Yes,
With, we have,
maybe Natalie Rothman is a bit tired of our questions.
No, this was fascinating, but you guys worked very hard.
it was that I was thinking about. I had not courage to say it, but maybe Natalie is tired of us. But I just reply that this seminar remind that this seminar needs to enter it, but not for of you, of course. Just remind that this seminar will be recorded, and so the people who couldn't follow it can find it in YouTube channel of Deputazione di Storia Patria per le Venezie, e direi che credo che per oggi abbiamo occupato comunque quasi tutto il tempo a disposizione, quindi riservo il diritto di fare domande a Natalie via mail, e do appuntamento per chi voglia seguirci ancora. Vi ringrazio ovviamente per la vostra partecipazione, che è stata molto intensa e ha portato a una bellissima discussione, molto, molto feconda. Do appuntamento per chi volesse seguirci ancora. Resteremo nel Mediterraneo e torneremo con Venice in Question il 24 febbraio, se no 24 febbraio, so on February 24, con la presentazione del libro di Francisco Appellanis, discusso da un altro ottomanista che tutti voi conoscete, il collega Tommaso Stefini. Quindi se potete seguirlo, seguitelo, perché credo sarà una discussione molto interessante. Non ci sarò io a moderare, ci sarà il collega Nicola Carotenuto di Oxford, ma io cercherò di seguirlo perché veramente è interessante come tutti gli appuntamenti di Venice in Question, ma ho un debole per il Levante, come si è capito anche oggi da questa discussione. Quindi vi ringrazio ancora entrambi per la vostra partecipazione e spero di ritrovarvi entrambi a Venezia in una situazione più comoda. E alla prossima allora.
Grazie mille a voi.
Grazie mille. Buona serata.
Buona serata a voi.
Ciao, ciao.